Okay. Good morning, LinkedIn Live. How are you all doing? I feel because I've got Eric with me, I feel as though I should be saying Grand Rising. And Eric, you knew that was coming, right?
I had a feeling, yes. Good
Those of
morning,
you,
Grand
yes,
Rising.
Grand Rising, Eric. Some people may recognise Eric's voice. We won't go into his previous incarnation where you may have heard his voice. But I'm really pleased this morning to be joined by Eric. So Eric is standing in for Emma, who's usually here. Emma is traveling around the US at the moment, so she's on a completely different time zone. So Eric has kindly agreed to join me to talk about this really interesting topic. Eric's background, Eric is an educator, has a background, studied law, did a stint in the corporate space, and is joining us this morning. But Eric, why don't you just share a little bit more about what it is that you do currently with, sort of schools and colleges and organisations?
Of course. So, good morning, everyone, and thanks for having me on, Cheryl. So, I'm Eric Sterling. As mentioned, I currently am in the educational space, having spent some time initially studying law, working in the civil service, and doing bits with government. So, for the past 8, 9 years, I've been qualified as a teacher, which has provided me with a really good opportunity to almost go back to where it all started as an individual back in education. So currently, I am running an organization called Sterling Academy Youth, and we work with schools up and down the country, delivering workshops on a range of social issues. Um, Workshops which enable young people to tap into themselves. So things around mental health, things around belonging and inclusion, as well as topics around drugs and alcohol and friendships, and yeah, just a range of really interesting topics. So, still within the educational space. And my role also takes me into all different types of educational settings as well. So, both in the private and independent sector, as well as working with state schools.
Amazing. And it's really interesting having a teacher on here because I almost felt like, having Eric here was like having your homework marked. My when she was on, Eric was like, I'm prepared. I've like done some notes. And I think if I got Eric to hold his notes up, there'd probably be like A4 sheets of workings and notes and stuff. So I had to step it up a gear, Eric. I don't normally do this much prep. I'm
No,
not
no. Let's see how it goes.
exactly. So do you know what? We've already had a comment come in. So if you're on live, please do, kind of like say hi in the comments or whatever, or just, put your thoughts in. We are going to get into it, and then we are going to try to at least give our thoughts on the answer to this question. We may or may not agree. And just to advise as well, we're certainly not here to bash either private school education or state school education. We're just here to have an interesting discussion and come up also with some practical tips for you as a parent or as an organisation, regardless of what system your children are going through. So yes, we've already got somebody commenting. So we're gonna get into that, and we're gonna share the comments as we go through. Before we start, though, so obviously we're in the UK, and so Eric is going to very kindly just explain the school system here in the UK, so that we've just got some context around the different systems that we're talking about. So Eric, go for it.
Okay, brilliant. So we're speaking about schools within the UK. So for anyone who's joining us from anywhere else around the world, or for anyone in the UK who sometimes hears the different terms, public schools, independent schools, private schools, state schools, grammar schools thrown around, and may sort of wish to kind of gain a bit of an understanding on the distinctions between the five. I've got a bit of a breakdown here. So public schools, which you may have heard of, are considered and perceived to be the most exclusive and prestigious private schools out there. So if you think of examples such as Eton College or Harrow, Wellington College, the ones which we would, which a lot of prime ministers have been educated at, and they typically contain a boarding facility for students to stay overnight as well, and they're highly selective. If we're talking about independent schools, they are overseen by a board of trustees, and it's a fee paying institution as well as boarding schools. Private schools are ran by the owners, and they're also competitive, and there's also a fee attached to attending. Grammar schools are an interesting school to sort of understand as
Mm,
well, because the distinction between grammar schools and the three previously mentioned are that there aren't any fees to attend. Um, they are academically orientated, and in order to gain entrance to the schools, you are sitting the 11 plus exams,
mm.
um, and they are funded by the government. Although you may find that you do have to pay some costs at a grammar school. And the last school, which isn't fee paid by the parents as such, is government funded, and they provide education free of charge, and that is the state schools we're speaking about.
Cool. Amazing. Do you know what? I didn't know some of those distinctions, even between like say the public ones and then the independents. That was really interesting. And then in terms of just some of the stats, because obviously we're kind of like linking it to advantage in sort of like life, in work, etc. So some of the stats is that around 7 to 8% of the population of children, sorry, are in what we would term private schools. So I guess those first three buckets that Eric was explaining there, and then the rest are in state schools. So it's about 500,000 children go through that private school system, and then about 8 million in state schools. What's interesting, so where this topic started from, I've got a lot of pictures to show you. I don't know how well that's going to come across, but
Right, it looks like our current cabinet, Cheryl.
well, this was the Tory leadership.
Oh, right, yes.
There was and here's the current cabinet, and there was a lot of stuff around. Oh my gosh, it's the most diverse, Tory leadership race, most diverse cabinet. But one of the things I did, so in the workshops and stuff that I do, I delved into it and I was like, let me just see how many of them have been, privately educated. And lo and behold, I think in the leadership race one, I think all but one of them was no, sorry, all but two of them were privately educated, and in the cabinet, the three sort of like senior ministers, they were all privately educated. And you had some stats there, so it's something like only 11 prime ministers in entire history in the UK have been to state schools. I think Liz Truss actually is one of the latest ones.
She is, interestingly,
Yeah,
yes. Although
last
she did go to Oxford.
she did. She did, because that's the other stat that of those of the prime ministers, 44 of prime ministers have been to Oxford. In fact, 45 now. If I had Liz Truss, I think, and yeah, 29 have been to Oxford, 14 to Cambridge, and 33 of the 56 UK prime ministers were educated at either Eton, Harrow, or Westminster.
Right, interesting.
So it's and there's the whole thing about the ruling elite. But in terms of the world of work as well, so there's definitely, in the government there's a slant towards privately educated. In the FTSE 100, so if we bring it into the world of work, FTSE 100 CEOs, in 1987, so we're going back a bit, 70% of CEOs were privately educated, private school educated.
Right,
2007, it was 54%. And it wasn't until 2016, for the first time, it was 50-50.
interesting.
Yeah. But given that, the small percentage of population that go to state schools, we can tell actually there's still a massive skew towards so almost this bias towards people that are privately educated, which I think is fascinating. So let's get into, I think maybe, why don't we just get into like just a couple of the comments here first of all. So there's something around, does private school help with work ethic? So I know, because you work in both, don't you? You go into both private schools and state schools. What's your view around this in terms of, does private school help with things like, work ethic, discipline, etc.? What are your views on that?
So I guess it's helpful to kind of set out the context of, I wouldn't say most, but a lot of private schools. So you tend to have smaller class sizes, which means the ratio of adult to student is smaller. They tend to have better facilities because funding is less of an issue,
Mm.
which then plays a part in extracurriculum activities being an option to students.
Yeah.
So whether there's an interest in drama or art or rowing, the child has a more holistic access to education and more opportunities to be stimulated. You do tend to find that the children can have a more enthusiastic attitude towards learning, um, as a result of there being a keener range of interests,
Yeah.
which then has an impact on sometimes their academic ability to perform and to follow instructions and to sort of
Yeah.
just be better engaged. And then sometimes you're finding that there are more curriculum choices. So if you're interested in philosophy or interested in Japanese or quite a sort of a subject which isn't necessarily accessed
Yeah.
or available at the state school.
Mhm.
Um, these are also factors which can then shape what the child is like within that environment.
Yeah.
Also taken into account in order to be in a private school. It does require the resources, and we're talking about money here. We're
Mhm.
talking about the finances in order for the child to be in such an environment.
Yeah.
So then we have to kind of take into account the context of what home life may be like.
Yeah.
And again, if parents have got quite lucrative or high roles within the community, these are able to definitely have an impact on a child's learning
Mm.
within the classroom.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely, yeah, and and as you said it, I thought what was really interesting, the thing about the breadth of, just access to, as you say, extracurricular activities and all of that stuff means that, yeah, it's perhaps not surprising that the children maybe are more engaged because actually there's so much more for them to do. So if they're not so interested in the mainstream or the core, sort of subjects and activities that you would get in state school, there's more of a breadth. So actually there's almost like a virtuous circle then, isn't there, of being more engaged, wanting to learn more, learning more, achieving more, etc.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the way you describe it is really accurate. So, if say for example you're less stimulated in one subject,
Yeah.
you've got something that could really capture your
Yeah.
interest,
Exactly.
whether
Yeah.
within the school curriculum or whether it's outside of the school day, whether
Yeah.
it's access to um, sort of like music lessons or
Mm.
it being provided in a way which
Yeah.
enables you to sort of
Yeah.
balance out,
Yeah.
perhaps if you're not as interested or if you're
Yeah.
not great in one area.
Cool. No, that's good. That's good. One of the things I wanted to talk about was, and we've had conversations about these sorts of things before, but I want to talk about expectations and how how important it is for expectations to be raised, and whether or not private schools do that better than state schools, and whether there are ways that we can almost like bridge that gap if there is a challenge. So I heard a really good example on a Radio 4 program that Shapi Korsani, the comedian, did, and she was talking about going through the choice of schools for her child, and she was talking to a friend, and the friend said, one of the things about private schools is, for example, they get the kids to write letters to, politicians or, people that they see in the public eye, and they almost instill in those children, you will be in those spaces because you are like them. They come from spaces, that you're in, and there's a really famous example actually of Meghan Markle doing something similar when she was 11. She famously saw this kind of sexist ad for washing up liquid and sent a letter to Procter and Gamble and Hillary Clinton and blah blah blah. And this person was basically saying, how do we instill that same sense of expectation and ambition for children that are in state schools? So is that something that you see? Do you see kind of like differences in just expectation levels between children in the two schools?
I mean, I guess it kind of like boils down to the educator. So as you kind of gave that example, I can think of um, teaching full time and an activity we did when we did exactly what you described.
Yeah.
Um, the young people, the students were dissatisfied about. I'm trying to think what the example was at the time, but it did involve writing a letter to the local MP about different changes that could be
Yeah.
undertaken. It was an activity modeling how to write a letter, the salutations, the content, an argument, presenting that.
Mm,
But I guess what private schools are probably better at doing is the sort of social capital which is instilled within the child.
mm, yeah.
Um, there is this approach where the children are being prepared to become the champions of the universe, if we're going to use
Yeah.
that phrase.
Yeah.
That phrase, um, and it's interesting because some of the workshops I deliver, I will be using the exact same content in a private school,
Yeah.
um, and in a state school, and the outcomes can be really interesting. Sometimes I get more engaged students in the state schools because they're coming from a perspective where they haven't necessarily um, been sheltered, or they've got sometimes a bit more of a realistic dynamic of how it actually
Mm,
operates. Um, so it's really interesting, actually. It's really interesting. But I think
mm,
in direct response to your question, I think there is this sense of expectation,
yeah.
also encapsulating an entitlement of this is where I ought to be. It's
Yeah.
almost so that there's a stronger sense of self-belief in
Yeah.
some instances,
Yeah.
and there are more opportunities being presented to challenge.
Yeah.
So rather than to sort of like accept the status quo and to do as
Yeah.
you're told, um, it's encouraged to perhaps be a bit more creative.
That's so interesting, isn't it? Because as you're talking now, I was almost linking it to. I heard something there once which sort of said that there is a mindset, and this probably links into like class and social mobility. But I heard that there is a mindset which is more apparent sometimes in people from a working class background, which is that when they go into certain spaces, and when I say spaces, you can think of that in terms of roles or whatever, which is like, which is it's not for people like me. People like me don't do that sort of thing, or those spaces aren't for people like me, and I think that maybe links into the expectation thing in terms of, oh, people from my sort of background don't do that sort of thing. We're do you know what I mean? It's not for us. It's not for people like us. Whereas I'm guessing that you just don't get that same level of self doubt, basically, from young people that have gone through the private sector.
I think because again, I think it can happen, but
Yeah,
maybe on a smaller scale. So
yeah,
taking into account as well, within private schools, you do have a spectrum of people who will attend. You will have
yeah,
those whose parents are, stealing from Peter to pay Paul in order to ensure
yeah,
that children have access to this environment. And then you've got
yeah,
your uber rich who do not necessarily have to sort of like worry um,
yeah,
about the financing in the same way. And within private schools, you've also got children who are struggling. You've got those who are
right,
essentially failing to keep up,
okay,
and they're aware of it. They're not getting the A stars. They're not
mm,
sort of like thriving academically. Um, so
okay,
not everyone is a complete
yeah,
success, and not everyone remains in those settings as well. I'm thinking of one particular school I went into, and an activity involved looking at a video, and this video was filmed in a state school. And the reaction of the class, we went into a discussion. One student's response as to why the child made the choice in the video
mm,
was because she attends a state school and is therefore less intelligent. Now, the interesting point that this child made, and led to a child in the class who had attended a state school herself, sort of like
right,
react, say, well, actually, there were two children in that video, and one knew what the correct answer was, and the other one didn't, which demonstrates that attending a state school wasn't a factor as to why the other child didn't know the answer. And then
yeah,
there was an interesting dynamic where this student then said, well, actually, I've got a friend of mine whose mum is at the moment sort of like in the process of removing her child from a private school because the child's not doing well there and the child's going through
mm,
all. of dynamics. And it was this really interesting learning experience because within this class, it wasn't an insular class where everyone had just been privately educated. There were some
Yeah.
students in the class who had experienced a state school, and myself having attended a state school, and having the opportunity to go into a range of different schools as an adult, I then sort of said, okay, this is a great learning opportunity to kind of like unpick some of the ideas that young people may have about the different school settings. And then when I sort of like revealed to the class that I'd gone to a state school, all of a sudden all these other kids who had had different moments where they had been in state school started to sort of like put their hands up, and they felt quite empowered to admit what their journey had been to date. And
Yeah.
that was a really interesting dynamic. And I guess it from a sort of like diversity equality perspective,
Mm.
unfortunately sometimes those moments don't happen enough.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and and I know obviously we're sort of talking about, and my work is primarily in an organizational setting. You're still in the academic setting, but I do
Yes.
think it's important. And I love, that explanation, that example that you were giving when you talked about the fact that you, by then sort of sharing your experience, because I don't know whether do you get this a lot then? Do people assume that you had a private school education? Do you get that sometimes? And then there's something a little bit screwed.
I'm not sure. I think there's to be honest with you, it's not a question I get asked
Yeah.
often. But I felt in that moment it was
Yeah.
appropriate to sort of
Yes.
let these young people know,
Yeah.
particularly when there was a judgment being made about what the educational sort of
Yeah.
like outcomes or what the abilities of someone who would
Yeah.
attend a state school would be.
Yeah.
Because sometimes that opportunity hasn't had, and then we
Yeah.
go from the school is to the workplace, and then
Yeah.
there's an idea within the workplace
Yeah.
that if you have had a private school education,
Yeah.
I guess this kind of like taps into the second part of the question
Absolutely.
about an
Absolutely.
unfair advantage.
Yeah.
You say you've sort of gone to, the rowing, the Royal School, and you've done a bit of rowing, and you're like, oh, I've got a trustee who went there. Let's get you in to kind of like have a chat with that person. And I guess it
Exactly.
then taps into nepotism. We haven't really spoken about that.
Yeah. Let's take it there. I mean, the whole, like, nepotism and social capital and networks and all of that, which you kind of touched on a little bit before in terms of expectations, but there's some of the stats, just taking it back to politics a bit. Apparently, so at one point in time, 100% of David Cameron's cabinet, not only were they all privately educated, but they knew each other personally from university.
That would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, this is an interesting comment. Before we go into the into this one about social capital, let's just read Sarah's comment. So I was told outright only recently that I wouldn't get any further in my career because I didn't have a sexy CV. I love that. Sexy job, sexy CVs. When I questioned this, it was deemed I didn't have the right education, or maybe did, hadn't gone to the right school, hadn't attended university, despite the great work I delivered. Investors don't invest if you don't have the right profile. This isn't discussed enough at board level as they're too embarrassed and afraid of having the discussion. Do you know what, Sarah? I totally identify with this because I've done some work with venture capitalists, and that is the world in and of itself. In terms of, you want to talk about, kind of elitism and all of that sort of thing, it's a major issue. So I totally get that. Yeah, so there is that thing about, and I know some of the organizations that call me and they've got a real issue where certain senior directors or partners or C-suite members only want to target certain universities. If you haven't been to Durham, Cambridge, they're not even interested. It is actually bonkers. Let's talk about the social capital bit and the nepotism, Eric. What are your thoughts there then, in terms of the advantage that people get as a result of being connected?
So yeah, thank you for your comment, Sarah. I think you make a really good one. The point about not having attended the right university then makes the qualifications and the level of attainment insequential in terms of being right for the job.
Mm,
It's a case of, well, you've studied here, therefore we trust you enough,
yeah.
and you've demonstrated whatever it is that the employer wishes to sort of buy into in terms
Yeah.
of recruitment. So I guess having spoken to sort of like a number of friends who have attended private schools, they sort of speak quite strongly around the ability to form connections, and those connections then leading on to opportunities.
Hmm.
And um, grades and qualifications, yes, it's still being an important factor, but the connections and the relationships they've been able to develop and cultivate over the
Yeah.
years has played a strong role, undeniably, in their career
Yeah.
trajectory.
Yeah. And what I mean, some of the conversations that we've had before, and literally just yesterday, I was having a conversation with my fellow awards organisers about this. I have this deep burning frustration that it's really difficult to instill in young people, in particular from certain backgrounds, the importance and the power of those networks. There's a saying in business. So in business, people say, your network is your net worth.
Yes.
I think people get it in terms of in business, in entrepreneurial circles, but getting young people from working class background or state school background to appreciate the power of an introduction, a warm introduction, or being able to piggyback onto someone's network is so underestimated. What is it what can we do to help kind of either raise the importance of that for young people, or you know leverage those networks for them and on their behalf?
Mm, yeah. What can we do? I'm seeing an interesting comment
Go for it.
talking
Yeah.
about economic and funding factors. So I guess that kind of leads on to one of my suggestions. So schools and colleges must enable disadvantaged youngsters um, from their educational prospects being negatively influenced by finances, whether that's funding within to the school,
Yeah.
or as we all are aware of, the cost of living crisis, which is having an impact on
Mm,
families up and down the country. So that's one area, and I guess it's a bigger sort of like policy discussion around ensuring that young people's educational prospects aren't negatively impacted.
yeah.
I guess from a practical, what can parents do? Because I know we're running out of time. What can parents do? What can the kids? So I guess one of the so I read a really interesting report recently by the Sutton Trust, and Sir Peter Lampall, who's the founder, sort of like spoke about inequalities regionally. So
Mhm.
we've known for a while that London and the southeast, even as recently as the A levels and GCSE results that came out last year, they have this part of the country had the highest level of top grades.
Mm,
And then when we kind of like look into what is happening, which is leading to sometimes these outcomes from a household perspective, linking back to the point around expectations and social capital, parents have to plug the gap in however way that in whichever ways they can, and we know that
mm,
investing in extra tuition is something which produces good results.
mhm.
Providing extra help, so if your child has a STEM interest, seeing what programs they can get involved in if they are attending a state school, because sometimes this will be offered as part of a package to young people at a private school, and
Mm,
what then happens is they go off to do these placement programs, and they're making connections with lecturers, and they're sat in big
yeah.
auditoriums, and they're having these discussions, and they're having these lunches, and they're just feeling quite comfortable in an environment where they're not necessarily being assessed. So when it does come to the assessment centres, and those who have never been in that environment before, there is that sort of rabbit in front of a headlight sort of
Yeah.
moment. It
Yeah.
counts. So they haven't
Yeah.
necessarily had that opportunity to muck about and get it wrong. So
Yeah.
I guess providing young people with experiences as early as possible is always a
Yeah.
great thing. There
Yeah.
are a bunch of different internship programs and
Mhm.
mentorship programs and placement programs which are providing insight at an earlier age
Yeah.
for young people. So those who aren't necessarily from that environment or aren't stemming from a social class where they've got access to accountants and doctors
Mm,
and dentists who pop around for lunch, they're able to kind of feel a bit at ease, and it
Yeah.
sort of like a greater sense of um, esteem, really,
Mm,
and confidence to then go off to fit in. And I know we haven't touched on belonging in sense of belonging
yeah.
in the workplace, which is a massive topic, far too big for this discussion.
Part two.
Yeah, we'll have to set up another part two.
Yeah, I think it's some of the tips that you gave, they were really good in terms of what parents can do. I didn't even really think about that in terms of exposing your children, your young people to a just a really broad range of interests, activities, and spaces. I like what you said about sending them off to do kind of internships or just attend these sessions or whatever where they're then having to mix with different types of people because these are all then really good social skills, aren't they?
Yeah.
You can benefit from. What about organizations? And I'm thinking about I think you might have touched on sort of mentoring, but so say for organizations, especially if they're taking on like apprentices or real entry level grads that maybe haven't got that much experience, what should they be thinking about doing in terms of almost like bridging the gap, if that makes sense? So bridging that gap, if somebody hasn't got, they've got this expectation gap, they're not used to the concept even of social capital, whatever. What are your thoughts around what they should do? And then we'll go on to Denise's question. Morning, Denise.
Well, it sounds like the employers are operating from a good place, so
Mm,
they're well intentional in the sense of wishing to get a diverse mix of candidates into their
yeah,
workplace, and this is a great start. However, this is not enough, so they need to really think about once that applicant, that candidate arrives in this workplace, how can they ensure that the transition is smooth, they
mm,
feel able to fit into a culture which may be different to where they're coming from.
yeah,
So I think it's really important that the organizations work with other organizations, partner up
mm,
to gain an understanding into how best they can support those new entrants in order for their time there to be a success.
yeah,
Sometimes that might mean speaking to organizations such as my own or other organizations out there which exist
yeah,
who can facilitate those conversations and come
yeah,
up with programs and come up with strategies which will give the candidate really the weaponry and the tools in order to be a thriving success in the
yeah,
workplace, because we do know that the starting off a role is really the beginning of a new journey.
for sure. For sure. Let's go on to morning, Denise. Hope you are
More
good.
than this.
Let's go on to Denise's question. How can employers get involved to help local schools? So obviously you go into schools and run programs and whatever. What more would you like to see from employers in terms of going into schools? That's a good question.
So I'm thinking of a workshop I did with a bunch of dentists and a vet and someone from one of the big four. I can't remember which one. And essentially, it was just us sort of. So it was part of a series of sessions, and this one provided young people an opportunity to ask a range of different questions in terms of what goes on in these organizations. And I think one of the questions that came from one of the young people to one of the accountants at the big four was, are you using Bitcoin? And which is kind of very topical for young people
Yeah,
in this day and age. What just kind of like maybe asking questions which they wouldn't necessarily get to ask because they're not necessarily having the opportunity to
yeah,
interact with professionals in such an informal way. It's just kind of like what they're seeing on the news or in a program. In terms of practically what organizations can be doing, I think there's nothing bigger than real life experiences. So if
mm,
you're able to cultivate those relationships and have young people have a taste today at your organization, coming in, sitting in a boardroom, seeing what that feels like,
mhm,
seeing people at work. Um, those are experiences we all know, having attended school ourselves. The things we always remember are those out of day opportunities when we went on that trip, or we caught the train and we went into the city, or we went to a
yeah,
museum, whatever it was. And these are the experiences that really resonate and can be quite life changing. So
yeah,
I'd encourage
yeah,
organizations to really invest in those
Yeah,
opportunities. See it as a priority
yeah,
if they wish to be engaged in doing the
yeah.
work.
That's interesting. And I want to take it back to something that Sarah said as well around boards having more conversations about this. So boards having conversations where they recognise that there can be these differences in terms of, levels of expectations. I know we've got this comment by Najim around, limitation, and he's really sort of talking about mindset and, allowing things to get in between your goals. But yeah, boards having conversations around the fact that you might get an intake of interns and some might have more capital than others, and actually how do you be aware of that and be aware of potential bias or favoritism that might creep in, and the nepotism, as you said, because you may have somebody who's their parents play golf with one of the partners or whatever, and how do you kind of overcome those sorts of things. So I think there's something about, I think the more we talk about it and um, make these stats known and have these sorts of conversations, hopefully it starts to level the playing field a little bit. Um, so let's just go. We're going to wrap up with. I'm going to ask you the question. So obviously, in the style of debate. Obviously, debating is something that lots of private schools do, but I think we're starting to see it a bit more in state schools as well, because it's one of those potential advantages. Being able to debate something. What are your thoughts, Eric? Is private school education an advantage? Let's leave out the unfair bit. Is it an advantage in the workplace, in your opinion? Yes or no?
I mean, it'll be difficult for me to argue that is a disadvantage.
Yeah,
It's clear there's clearly numerous favourable outcomes that
yeah,
can come from a private school education: attainment, social class group mixing,
yeah,
opportunities. So yeah, absolutely,
yeah, yeah.
unequivocally, it does provide an
Do
advantage.
you think it's unfair? So, and I know this is a slightly more philosophical debate, which maybe we bring on again, but do you think it's an unfair advantage?
Do you know what? It depends. I mean, we know we live in a world which isn't fair. You
Right.
know, as I say, sometimes to young people, a fair is a place where you go and get candy floss and go on a ride.
Yeah.
There are different struggles. I'll be absolutely honest with you. I wouldn't want anyone sat in who has attended a private school to think that they've not had to work hard.
Yeah.
If I go into a school and we're covering substances, the young people in the private schools will be talking to me about doing expensive drugs and sort of like having access to, cabinets of alcohol, which isn't a topic which comes up in the state schools I visit.
Mm,
Similarly, I'm finding in the private schools there are higher levels of self harm amongst the girls, body
mm,
image issues, which seldomly come up in the state schools. So to kind of say
mm,
to link it to the workplace, there's certainly a preparation that comes from the private schools, which is more inherently built in the individual
yeah.
to thrive and to be successful
Yeah.
in essentially career progression.
Mhm.
So is it unfair? I mean, if we're going to take it in its entirety, yes.
Okay.
And
I got a firm yes. Okay.
how about you, Cheryl?
Um, I definitely say it's from what I've seen, my experience. I would say that it's an advantage. And for clarity, a bit like you, Eric, I've been to a state school, so but I would say that there is definitely an advantage, and I think that's borne out by the stats. Yeah, so the stats, the fact that 50% of CEOs are from a private school background, when only 7% of children are going to private school. That I think sort of says it all. Is it unfair? Life's not fair, is it? The world is not fair. But it's interesting you kind of mentioning some of the disbenefits, actually some of the things that you see more on a personal level, linking into all sorts of interesting topics. But yeah, I think we're gonna leave it there. Unless, have you got any final thoughts, Eric, that you want to leave the audience with, just in terms of like sort of final tips or final comments?
Yeah, I guess like for those who have attended a state school, such as myself, who have gone on to do remarkable things, um, it does exist also. We are living in a world where family sizes are reducing, which is enabling parents to use their money in just more disposable ways. So
Yeah,
we can understand why private school is more attractive. If there's one child in a family, potentially two parents, four grandparents. It's an investment into a child. So we can kind of see the reasons why um, ensuring that your child gets the best brain possible is
mm,
an attractive outcome. However, we've got Brampton Manor Academy, a state school in London, which has recently achieved better A level grades than Eton College. So if anyone's not aware of that school, Brampton Manor Academy, do check it out. So it's not a guarantee.
mm,
It's not a guarantee for success, and there
yeah,
are many a people who have been state educated and have gone on to have successful careers.
yeah. Amazing. Perfect. I think we're going to leave it there. I might leave it on just to come back to one of Sarah's comments, because I think it's really nice. Something about organizations, and I'm guessing in the work that Sarah does, organizations going into schools to let them know what's out there. I think that's a really good sort of takeaway. And again, I love the takeaway that you gave, which was around the parents just exposing their children and their young people um, to differences. My grandchild has just been accepted there. What, into Brampton? Into Brampton, Sarah? Just answer that for us, because I think we'll be quite excited if it's a yes. We'll be excited on your behalf.
Really lovely school, by the way. I've been in there as well.
Lovely.
So hardworking. At
Yeah,
break and lunch, you had 200 young people sort of in the canteen. You would almost expect it to be wild. So organized. After left at 3, they were there until 5 doing past papers. And this is a state school, and their work ethic was
yeah, yeah. It's
absolutely incredible.
Brampton. Well, yeah, amazing. Yeah, that sounds amazing, Sarah. And it's it's hopefully it's
Congratulations, Sarah. Well done.
congratulations. Start of a very rich learning experience which is what it's all about. Okay, we're gonna end it there. Eric, thank you so much for coming on. We must get you on I mean, there's so many topics that we're going to cover sort of going forwards, because we've just started these. So Friday mornings, we're here pretty much every week. Eric, I'm sure we'll be getting you back. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right, and everybody, take care. Have an amazing Friday.
Have an amazing Friday, guys, and enjoy the
Bye.
long weekend. See you.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.